list is about pop culture as a whole and not the tiny indie ghetto where the Velvet Underground are still referred to as the most important band ever because they invented being pasty-faced and wearing sunglasses as a kind of cool. The Stone Roses may have invented Britpop and were referred to as such as far back as 1988, but in terms of the whole world their influence is very local. Elvis Presley. The incredible Elvis Presley life story began when Elvis Aaron Presley was born to Vernon and Gladys Presley in a two-room house in Tupelo, Mississippi, on January 8, 1935. His twin brother Jesse Garon was stillborn, leaving Elvis to grow up as an only child. He and his parents moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948, and Elvis graduated from Humes High School there in 1953. Elvis' musical influences were the pop and country music of the time, the gospel music he heard in church and at the all-night gospel sings he frequently attended, and the black R&B he absorbed on historic Beale Street as a Memphis teenager. In 1954, Elvis began his singing career with the legendary Sun Records label in Memphis. In late 1955, his recording contract was sold to RCA Victor. By 1956, he was an international sensation, with a sound and style that uniquely combined his diverse musical influences and blurred and challenged the social and racial barriers of the time. He ushered in a whole new era of American music and popular culture. The Beatles. So much has been said and written about the Beatles, and their story is so mythic in its sweep that it's difficult to summarize their career without restating cliches that have already been digested by tens of millions of rock fans. To start with the obvious, they were the greatest and most influential act of the rock era, and they introduced more innovations into popular music than any other group of their time. Moreover, they were among the few artists of any discipline that were simultaneously the best at what they did and the most popular at what they did. Relentlessly imaginative and experimental, the Beatles grabbed hold of the international mass consciousness in 1964 and never let go for the next 6 years, always staying ahead of the pack in terms of creativity and never losing the ability to communicate their increasingly sophisticated ideas to a mass audience. Their supremacy as rock icons remains unchallenged to this day, decades after their breakup in 1970. The Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones, British rock group formed in 1962, that drew on Chicago blues stylings to create a unique vision of the dark side of post-1960s counterculture. The original members were Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Brian Jones, Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts. Later members were Mick Taylor, Ron Wood and Darryl Jones. No rock band has sustained consistent activity and global popularity for so long a period as the Rolling Stones, still capable, more than 50 years after their formation, of filling the largest stadia in the world. Though several of their mid-1960s contemporaries, notably Bob Dylan, Paul McCartney, Eric Clapton and Van Morrison, have maintained individual positions in rock's front line, the Rolling Stones' nucleus of singer Jagger, guitarist Richards, and drummer Watts remains rock's most durable ongoing partnership. James Brown. James Brown, born May 3, 1933, American singer, songwriter, arranger, and dancer, who was one of the most important and influential entertainers in 20th century popular music and whose remarkable achievements earned him the sobriquet the hardest working man in show business. Brown was raised mainly in Augusta, Georgia, by his great-aunt, who took him in at about the age of 5 when his parents divorced. The segregated South during the Great Depression of the 1930s, Brown was so impoverished that he was sent home from grade school for insufficient clothes, an experience that he never forgot and that perhaps explains his penchant as an adult for wearing ermine coats, velour jumpsuits, elaborate capes, and conspicuous gold jewelry. Neighbors taught him how to play drums, piano, and guitar, and he learned about gospel music in churches and at tent revivals, where preachers would scream, yell, stomp their feet, and fall to their knees during sermons to provoke responses from the congregation. Brown sang for his classmates and competed in local talent shows, but initially thought more about a career in baseball or boxing than in music. Kraftwerk. Arguably the most influential band ever, Kraftwerk is a band who managed to invent not one but two genres of music. The German half-man, half-machine had the most profound effect on popular culture in one of the strangest cultural shifts of all time, when their Teutonic twinkling was picked up by hip black kids in the Bronx who understood Das Robot's subtle funkiness and used it as a template to create techno and by extension hip-hop. 10 years later, everyone was at it again when the band were used as the foundation for techno and acid house. There can be few dance floors not affected by this outfit. Jimi Hendrix. In his brief 4-year reign as a superstar, Jimi Hendrix expanded the vocabulary of the electric rock guitar more than anyone before or since. Hendrix was a master at coaxing all manner of unforeseen sonics from his instrument, often with innovative amplification experiments that produced astral quality feedback and roaring distortion. His frequent hurricane blasts of noise and dazzling showmanship, he could and would play behind his back and with his teeth, and set his guitar on fire, have sometimes obscured his considerable gifts as a songwriter, singer and master of a gamut of blues, R&B, and rock styles. Black Sabbath. A metal institution whose influence cannot be overstated, Black Sabbath pioneered the genre as they constructed the framework for subsequent subgenres within metal, with entire movements rising from blueprints laid out in single Sabbath songs. From the end of the 60s and throughout the entirety of the 70s, the band became legendary for the doomy chemistry between its players, Ozzy Osbourne's primal vocals, Tony Iommi's seismic riffing, Bill Ward's bluntly powerful drumming, and Geezer Butler's thunderous bass lines, all congealed into a sinister breed of hard rock and occult-fixated songcraft the world had never heard before. This untouchable original lineup was responsible for metal masterpieces like 1970's Paranoid, but when they splintered in 1979, Black Sabbath soldiered on with a cast of various, different singers, while Osbourne applied his Prince of Darkness persona to a successful solo career that would span decades. There were various reunions and partial reformations of the first Black Sabbath lineup, aiming to recapture some of their early evil energy on later period outings like 2013's 13. Sex Pistols. These days the Clash get all the credit, but as Mick Jones himself once remarked to me, there would have been nothing without the Sex Pistols. Like a mini Elvis, they came out of vacuum and changed popular culture in a sleepwalking late 70s UK. There is a good argument that at the same time the Ramones' impact was equally powerful, and indeed I have enjoyed this argument many times, but with the Pistols you get the added cultural baggage that was like a hammer blow to rock culture, creating the first-generation gap in rock and roll. If the Ramones' musical ideas have been endlessly adopted by bands ever since, then the Pistols just shade it with their overall cultural effect. Madonna. Madonna changed the trajectory of popular music not long after Borderline became her first top 10 hit in 1984. Fusing post-disco dance with effervescent pop, the song was unexpected and fresh, a trick that soon became her signature. Over a career that lasted for decades, Madonna ushered underground sounds into the mainstream, specializing in trends percolating in dance clubs. As she arrived at the dawn of the MTV era, she seized the possibilities of music videos, creating a series of sexy, stylish clips that earned her the reputation of a provocateur while also establishing the network as the bastion for hip culture in the 1980s. The process, she created the archetype of a modern pop star, one whose music was inextricably tied with its visual representation, and one who was loath to trade upon past glories. As Madonna entered her second decade of stardom, she continued to take artistic risks. She delved into modern R&B for 1994's Bedtime Stories and electronica for 1998's Ray of Light. David Bowie. David Jones began performing music when he was 13 years old. Learning the saxophone while he was at Bromley Technical High School. Another pivotal event happened at the school, when his left pupil became permanently dilated in a schoolyard fight. Following his graduation at 16, he worked as a commercial artist while playing saxophone in a number of mod bands, including the King Bees, the Manish Boys, and Davy Jones and the Lower Third. All three of those bands released singles, which were generally ignored, yet he continued performing, changing his name to David Bowie in 1966 after the Monkees' Davy Jones became an international star. Over the course of 1966, he released 3 mod singles on Pi Records which were all ignored. The following year he signed with D-Ram, releasing the music hall, Anthony Newley styled David Bowie. Upon completing the record, he spent several weeks in a Scottish Buddhist monastery. Once he left the monastery, he studied with Lindsay Kemp's mime troupe, forming his own mime company The Feathers in 1969. The Feathers were short-lived, and he formed the experimental art group Beckenham Arts Lab in 1969. Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan, original name Robert Allen Zimmerman, born May 24, 1941 in Duluth, Minnesota, U.S., American folk singer who moved from folk to rock music in the 1960s, infusing the lyrics of rock and roll, theretofore concerned mostly with boy-girl romantic innuendo, with the intellectualism of classic literature and poetry. Hailed as the Shakespeare of his generation, Dylan sold tens of millions of albums, wrote more than 500 songs recorded by more than 2,000 artists. Bob Dylan, original name Robert Allen Zimmerman, American folk singer who moved from folk to rock music in the 1960s, infusing the lyrics of rock and roll, theretofore concerned mostly with boy-girl romantic innuendo, with the intellectualism of classic literature and poetry. Hailed as the Shakespeare of his generation, Dylan sold tens of millions of albums, wrote more than 500 songs recorded by more than 2,000 artists. Bob Marley. Reggae's most transcendent and iconic figure, Bob Marley was the first Jamaican artist to achieve international superstardom, in the process introducing the music of his native island nation to the far-flung corners of the globe. Marley's music gave voice to the day-to-day struggles of the Jamaican experience, vividly capturing not only the plight of the country's impoverished and oppressed but also the devout spirituality that remains their source of strength. Backed by his all-star band The Wailers, Marley delivered classics in the ska era of the early 60s, all but invented roots music with 70s albums like Catch a Fire, and offered millions of listeners an entry point to reggae with his posthumous Best of Collection 1984's Legend. His songs of faith, devotion, and revolution created a legacy that continues to live on not only through the music of his extended family but also through generations of artists the world over touched by his genius. Joy Division. Formed in the wake of the punk explosion in England, Joy Division became the first band in the post-punk movement by later emphasizing not anger and energy but mood and expression, pointing ahead to the rise of melancholy alternative music in the 80s. Though the group's raw initial sides fit the bill for any punk band, Joy Division later incorporated synthesizers taboo in the low-tech world of 70s punk and more haunting melodies, emphasized by the isolated, tortured lyrics of its lead vocalist Ian Curtis. While the British punk movement shocked the world during the late 70s, Joy Division's quiet storm of musical restraint and emotive power proved to be just as important to independent music in the 1980s. Grandmaster Flash. OK. Not strictly the inventor a whole genre all by himself. The Flashman dressed in a series of outfits that would make Blackpool Illuminations cringe and managed to get his name in the Book of Firsts with a series of hits that popularized the form in the first place. Hip-hop is now one of the key musics in the world both musically and culturally, and every backward-wearing hat wannabe gangsta on the planet is deafening themselves to the thundering beat and the fistful of rhymes whilst copying the swagger from the form of music. Ravi Shankar. It was not intentional, but the late Indian sitar virtuoso created a mass interest in so-called world music when he teamed up with the Beatles in the late 60s. Ravi played the amazing ragas of classical India that captivated a whole new generation who saw them as tripped-out masterpieces, certainly not the intention of the very strict player himself. The newly wealthy youth of the 60s had discovered a whole new world outside the Anglo-American axis. A whole new area of rich talent has been promoted or ripped off since then.